Pain is real, but suffering is something we often grow ourselves. Think back to a moment in your life when you were deeply hurt. Maybe it was the loss of someone you loved. Maybe it was a betrayal, or maybe it was just a few words that pierced your heart more than anyone realized. That pain was real, undeniable, unavoidable. But what made it linger? What kept you awake night after night, even long after it happened? That was suffering no longer tied to the external event, but born from how we held on to it, how we responded to it, how we couldn't let it go. There is a well-known teaching from the Buddha that says pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Pain is a natural part of being human, but suffering is something we don't always have to choose. And that's what this video invites you to explore. Why is it that we all feel pain, yet some suffer deeply, while others remain surprisingly light? What does Buddhism reveal about this difference? And more importantly, how can we suffer less even when we can't avoid life's hardships? This journey won't promise to erase your pain, but it might just help you understand it better and gently guide you toward a softer, wiser way to walk through it. 1. Pain and suffering. Two things that seem the same, but are completely different. Most of us tend to confuse pain with suffering. We assume that if something hurts, it must automatically lead to suffering. That if we're in pain, there's no way we can feel at peace. But according to Buddhist teachings, these are two very different experiences, and learning to distinguish between them can change the way we live. Pain is a real direct experience. It often comes from the body or from life events. When we're physically injured, we feel pain. When someone we love passes away, we feel pain. When we're lied to or betrayed, it hurts. This is part of life. No one can avoid it. Even the Buddha never said we could live a life without pain. But suffering arises from within. It's not about what happens to us, but about how we respond to what happens. Let's take an example. Two people lose their jobs on the same day. One feels devastated, they spiral into self-blame, fear, and hopelessness. The other also feels upset but stays grounded, breathes through it, and begins looking for a new path. Same event, same pain, but the level of suffering completely different. So here's the question we rarely ask. Why do some people carry pain lightly while others are crushed by it? The answer lies not in luck nor in personality, but in awareness. Someone who has trained their mind to understand the nature of pain does not let that pain pull them into darkness. They can feel it, witness it, and allow it to pass through without turning it into something heavier. Instead of asking, how do I avoid pain? Buddhism gently invites us to ask, when pain comes, am I making it worse than it needs to be? The Buddha never denied the existence of sorrow or difficulty, but he offered a powerful insight. Suffering is not an automatic response to pain. It's something we unknowingly add on. And when we see that clearly, we begin to reclaim our freedom. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can absolutely learn how to control our response to what happens. And in that response, we decide whether we simply feel pain or whether we carry it until it becomes suffering. 2. Why do some suffer more than others in the same situation? There's a curious truth you may have witnessed in life. Two people experience the same kind of loss. One grieves for a time, then slowly accepts and moves on. The other remains in sorrow for years, unable to let go. Two people face the same financial crisis. One adapts, makes changes, and finds a new way forward. The other falls into despair, loses sleep, and becomes paralyzed by fear. Why is there such a difference? The answer lies in the mind, in how each person perceives life and responds to what happens. Those with a grounded inner life who understand the nature of reality don't collapse in the face of pain. They still feel sadness and loss, of course, but they don't resist it, don't rage against it. They carry a quiet understanding. This has come into my life because it was meant to, and like everything, it will also pass. But someone who hasn't trained their mind or who has never been taught how to understand pain can be swept away by the storm of questions. Why me? This is so unfair. I'll never get through this. It's not wrong to feel this way, but it's this very way of thinking that makes pain much heavier than it needs to be. In Buddhism, this mental confusion is called ignorance, not in the sense of intelligence, but in the sense of not seeing clearly. This ignorance causes us to cling to what is fleeting, try to control what's beyond our reach, react intensely to what is in truth part of the natural flow of life. And that's why a seasoned practitioner may still cry over loss, but their tears fall in peace. Someone who hasn't yet found inner clarity may also cry, but their tears are filled with bitterness, fear, and prolonged suffering. Same tears, but one kind washes away the pain, while the other deepens the wound. That difference doesn't come from the situation. It comes from how we understand life and how we understand ourselves. 3. The 8 worldly winds. A portrait of life in constant motion. In one of his well-known teachings, the Buddha spoke of something called the 8 worldly winds, 8 forces that constantly blow through our lives, tossing us about like leaves in a storm. These winds come in 4 pairs of opposites: gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. Each of us experiences these winds at some point, likely many times throughout our lives. But here's the deeper truth. It's not these winds themselves that make us suffer. It's the way we cling to the pleasant ones and desperately try to avoid the unpleasant ones. Take a moment to reflect. When someone praises us, we feel joy. But when criticized, we react with anger or shame. When we receive a gain, we feel lucky. But when something is taken from us, we feel wronged. When we are loved, we feel secure. But when misunderstood, we feel wounded. When we're happy, we begin to fear losing that happiness, and that fear itself becomes suffering. Look closely and you'll see. We're not suffering because of the winds. We're suffering because we're being controlled by them, because we cling too tightly to the favorable ones. Those who live mindfully approach this very differently. They don't deny the good, but they also don't lose themselves when things change. They understand that fame will fade, that today's praise can become tomorrow's criticism, that abundance can shift into loss, that every joy is eventually followed by change. And yet this doesn't make them pessimistic. Quite the opposite, it makes them free, because they no longer base their peace on things that constantly shift. They become like skilled sailors. They don't try to stop the wind nor run from it. They simply learn to move with it without being carried away. And that too is a skill that Buddhist teachings can offer each of us if we're willing to pause, reflect, and begin to see life for what it truly is. 4. Are you living under the illusion of control? Take a moment to pause and ask yourself, out of everything that happens in your life, how much do you actually control? Very little. Perhaps almost nothing. You can't control how others will treat you. You can't control what tomorrow may bring. And often you can't even control your own emotions the way you want to. Yet we live as if everything should be within our grasp. We plan, we prepare, we do everything to keep life safe, predictable, and smooth. And when things don't go as we hoped, we fall apart. Not necessarily because the event itself was terrible, but because we can't accept the truth that we never truly controlled it to begin with. The reality is, no matter how deeply you love someone, you can't guarantee they'll stay. No matter how well you care for your health, you can still fall ill. No matter how kind and honest you are, people may still misunderstand or betray you. And it's precisely this refusal to accept that truth that turns pain into prolonged suffering. On the other hand, those who walk a mindful path live differently. They don't fall into the illusion of control. They still care. They still try their best. But they no longer cling to the outcomes as if they are guaranteed. The Buddha never told us to abandon life. He simply urged us to abandon the illusion that life can be fully controlled. And it's this letting go, not of life, but of illusion, that brings true freedom. Because once we stop grasping at what can't be held, we free ourselves from so much of the suffering we unconsciously create. Satu 4. Are you living under the illusion of control? Take a moment to pause and ask yourself, out of everything that happens in your life, how much do you actually control? Very little. Perhaps almost nothing. You can't control how others will treat you. You can't control what tomorrow may bring. And often you can't even control your own emotions the way you want to. Yet we live as if everything should be within our grasp. We plan, we prepare, we do everything to keep life safe, predictable, and smooth. And when things don't go as we hoped, we fall apart. Not necessarily because the event itself was terrible, but because we can't accept the truth that we never truly controlled it to begin with. The reality is, no matter how deeply you love someone, you can't guarantee they'll stay. No matter how well you care for your health, you can still fall ill. No matter how kind and honest you are, people may still misunderstand or betray you. And it's precisely this refusal to accept that truth that turns pain into prolonged suffering. On the other hand, those who walk a mindful path live differently. They don't fall into the illusion of control. They still care. They still try their best. But they no longer cling to the outcomes as if they are guaranteed. The Buddha never told us to abandon life. He simply urged us to abandon the illusion that life can be fully controlled. And it's this letting go, not of life, but of illusion, that brings true freedom. Because once we stop grasping at what can't be held, we free ourselves from so much of the suffering we unconsciously create. 5. We can't avoid all pain, but we can avoid some of the suffering. Most of us spend our lives trying to avoid pain. We avoid what might hurt us, avoid difficult emotions, avoid unpleasant situations. But sometimes that very avoidance becomes the deeper source of our suffering. One clear example is social anxiety. Someone who fears crowds starts avoiding social settings. They decline invitations, avoid gatherings, and stay silent in meetings. At first it feels safer, but what happens next? The anxiety doesn't go away, it often gets worse. They begin to feel anxious about the possibility of becoming anxious. Worried not just about the social event, but about their own reaction to it. Instead of resolving the fear, they've simply turned it into a quiet shadow that follows them everywhere. The same pattern shows up in many areas of life. We fear heartbreak, so we don't open our hearts. We fear failure, so we don't take risks. We fear rejection, so we keep our distance from others. But fear doesn't erase pain. It just makes us live in a constant state of emotional tension, like we're standing outside of life watching, but never participating fully. In contrast, those who understand the path of mindfulness don't run from pain. They accept that pain is part of being alive. And because they accept it, they prepare for it. So when pain comes, they're not shocked, not resisting. It's like someone living in an area where storms are common. They can't stop the storm, but they can reinforce the roof. And when the storm comes, they're not swept away even though the storm is still just as strong. Life is the same. No one can avoid all pain. But someone who lives with awareness can build an inner life that is stable and resilient, so that when pain comes, as it surely will, they don't collapse and they don't suffer more than needed. 8. Mindfulness. Learning to stay with pain without being drowned by it. When life brings us something we didn't ask for, loss, illness, betrayal, disappointment, our first reaction is often resistance. We get caught in thoughts like, this shouldn't be happening. Why me? How do I fix this right now? But in that struggle, the pain becomes heavier. We don't just suffer because of the situation itself. We suffer because the mind refuses to accept what is already here. The Buddha didn't teach us to run away from pain. He offered a different path to sit quietly with ourselves, observe what's happening inside, and from that space, gently move forward. This is the heart of mindfulness practice. Mindfulness means being awake to what is present, whether it's joy or sadness, calm or chaos. We don't have to suffer more than necessary. Life already brings enough imperfection, enough pain that we simply cannot avoid. A goodbye with no return, a phone call bearing bad news, a moment of helplessness before the truth of impermanence. We cannot control everything. We can't stop aging, can't hold on to the people we love forever, and can't guarantee that tomorrow will unfold the way we expect. But amid all the things we can't control, there's still one thing we can do. We can choose not to suffer more than necessary. No need to add more blame. No need to tighten the knot of resistance. No need to carry the weight of what cannot be changed. Just pause, see clearly, and soften. When you begin to practice this, even little by little, you'll start to realize peace doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from no longer resisting what already is. Mindfulness won't make you immune to pain, but it will keep you from losing yourself in it. And that in itself is a quiet form of freedom. If you're feeling sadness today, allow yourself to feel it, but don't drown in it. If you're afraid, breathe with the fear, but don't let it steer your life. Because within you there is always a space of stillness, a place untouched by praise or blame, gain or loss, joy or sorrow. That space is the awareness the Buddha guided us toward. And you don't need to be a monk or perfect to touch it. You just need to begin from exactly where you are in this very moment. Thank you for walking this path with Mindful Healing today. Now, if this video spoke to you, feel free to share it with someone else who might be seeking a moment of peace. We'll see you again on the next journey toward inner freedom. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha.